Bound for Oregon, Chapter 2. "Mary Ellen," Father called, "bring me my saw, please, and take that small bucket and get some water." I hurried off to the well, but the minute I set down the brimming water bucket, I heard Mother's voice. "Mary Ellen," she called, "will you finish this churning while I get my soap to boiling? We'll need to take a lot of soap, you know." So much had to be done to prepare for our journey. All winter long I seemed to race from one chore to another, churning the butter, mending the baby, washing dishes, helping chard and spinning all the balls of soft wool that Mother wanted to take along. I hardly had any time for my lessons or for memorizing my favorite poems by Robert Burns. Of course, Louvina helped too. She was 6 years old now and could bring in potatoes from the root cellar and sticks of wood for kindling. And she was good at helping me watch little Cynthia. All the time I was doing my chores, my mind buzzed with thoughts about leaving things behind, our comfortable house, Mother's rose bushes that she loved so much, even Father's pottery wheel, which would not fit into our wagon, he said, about school, which I might never be able to go to again once we left Arkansas, and about Grandma, especially Grandma. When I first told her about Oregon, stopping by her house on my way to school, Grandma had laid aside the new quilt her busy fingers were stitching on. She pulled me down into her lap, smiling. Grandma's smile was like sunshine. I knew your pa would come to this," she said. "I just knew it." Behind the smile, though, I could hear her sadness in her voice. "He's gone and talked himself into it. Now what am I going to do without you, honey?" I had thought about this late into the night, and an answer had come to me. A wonderful answer. "Oh," I told her, "you'll soon be coming to Oregon too, just as you did to Arkansas." Grandma's thin arms tightened around me. I nestled my head into that comfortable space between her neck and soft cheek, as I had so many times before. In the silence, the ticking of the clock on the wall was like both our hearts beating. Then Grandma gave a long sigh. "Perhaps so, child," she said softly. "Perhaps so." She had to come, I thought afterwards. I couldn't imagine being without Grandma. She had taken care of me most of the first 7 years of my life. My mother had died when I was just 9 months old, and Father had carried me a long, long way on horseback through the snow to Grandma's house. Everyone said I was too young to remember that journey, but sometimes I thought I did. Father's breath in the frosty air, snowflakes swirling around us, whitening the horse's dark mane, a startled rabbit hopping across our path. A few months later, Father married my mother's sister, but soon after Louvina was born, his wife died also. So Grandma had raised my sister and me until the time 2 years ago when he married his third wife, Angelina Tate. As hard as I tried, I could not remember my own mother. All I knew about her was that Grandma had told me. She was a little bit of a thing, Grandma used to say. No bigger than a pint of cider, but lovely. Oh my, did she love to sing, and her hair was just the color of a copper penny. I wish that I had a copper-colored hair too, but mine was ordinary brown like Father's. Still, I was fond of singing. Then there was the time when Louvina and I were playing some game, and we got to laughing so we couldn't stop. All at once I noticed Grandma staring at me, tears shining in her eyes. "What's wrong, Grandma?" I asked anxiously. "Nothing is wrong," she answered, quickly dabbling her eyes. "It's just that you have your mother's smile." That made two things I had of hers, her smile and her love of singing. Father never wanted to talk about my mother. It was Grandma who had given me the picture of her, hazy as it was, that I carried around in my head. Without Grandma, I wouldn't have known her at all. Father had to trade in town for a large sturdy wagon with a canvas cover and 8 strong oxen to pull it. We would also need a tent for sleeping, harnesses, bridles, and saddles for the horses, a gun, and many tools. Then there were all the provisions for a long journey. food, clothing, medicines, extra parts for the wagon. Besides all this, Father had to make yokes and pins and bows for hitching up the oxen, and a heavy driving whip. I watched as he filled a long, slim bag, narrowed at one end, with shot. Carefully, he wove narrow strips of rawhide around it, and added a heavy handle and lashes. When it cracked, standing outside the barn, it sounded like the shot of a gun. "May I try it?" I asked. But when he put the whip in my hands, with its thick handle and lashes longer than the height of a man, I could barely lift it. Father smiled as I handed it back to him. "Takes practice," he said. In the meantime, Mother was packing the churned butter and homemade soap into pottery jars. She wrapped other provisions in snacks or poured them into jars: flour, cornmeal, rice, beans, sugar, salt, coffee, tea, dried fruit, molasses, lard, bacon, hams. When she was not readying the food supplies, she was busy spinning and weaving strong cloth, and making it up into clothing for the journey. I helped her cut out 2 pairs of pants for Father, and at night she sat stitching them by the fire. "What can we take with us?" Lavina and I asked one morning. Mother thought for a moment. "If each of you would like to make a reticule," she suggested, "you could fill them, and we will try to find a corner somewhere in the wagon." So Lavina and I set to work sewing 2 little cloth bags with drawstring tops. Inside them we put a few small toys, like our dolls with the carved wooden heads, and the little pottery clay dishes that Father had made. There were also compartments for needles and thread, and the leftover scraps of fabric we were sewing into quilt squares. I already had 10 squares finished in the 9-patch pattern that Grandma had taught me, and Lavina was just starting hers, and Grandma gave each of us a new thimble. On March 3rd, my 9th birthday, a brand new wagon with red wheels sat outside our front yard. Although the day was drizzly and cold, Lavina and I rushed outside to see it. The wagon looked tall and roomy, with the hickory boughs that would hold the canvas cover in place, curving high over the top. Father lifted us up, and the 2 of us sat side by side on the spring seat. As we sat there, our journey suddenly seemed real to me. For the first time, I felt a little prickle of excitement. "We're going to Oregon," I told Lavina, cracking a pretend whip over the heads of the pretend oxen. "Gee-haw!" Father laughed. "It won't be long now," he said. Our departure was set for the beginning of April. Mother was worried about leaving so early, since this was the time of the worst storms out on the plains. But so many people were going west this spring of 1852, Father had heard. If we left later, there might not be enough grass for our animals to graze on. It was better to risk storms, he said, than famine. Storms. Famine. When I heard those words, my mind clouded over again with doubts. Would we be all alone out on those plains, just one small family in one wagon? Back in the fall, when Father had spoken of going to Oregon, many others, like Cousin Fred and Mr. Pritchard, had talked about going too. But as the months went by little, they had changed their minds. Of course, Father said we would be safe, armed with our guidebook and a good dose of common sense, and I trusted Father completely. I wanted to do what would make him happy. Then why was it that I still felt so reluctant to leave? Mother had a little flower garden next to the front door. Sometimes, when her critical eye decided that their colors clashed, she would dig up one or another and move it to a different spot. Some of the plants popped right out of the ground, but others seemed anchored where they were, clinging with tiny curling root fingers to their small piece of earth. Maybe I was like one of those plants, I thought, holding fast to home. I thought of Grandma. She would not have hesitated a minute, I knew. She had married at 14, leaving her father's farm in Pennsylvania and going off to settle in the wilderness of Indiana. You wouldn't know it to look at her. She was so tiny and frail looking, like a gust of wind would blow her over. But Grandma was strong. With Grandpa, she had chopped down trees to build a log cabin, and in it had raised 8 children. She could paddle a canoe or shoot a rifle as well as any man, she always said proudly. One time when Grandpa was away, she shot a panther out of a tree. Another time an Indian tried to steal a ham from up in the cabin rafters. I was stirring a kettle of hot cornmeal mush when I saw him, said Grandma, her blue eyes dancing when she told the story. I just snatched up my wooden spoon out of the kettle and applied it to that Indian's backside. He left mighty quick, I can tell you. And after Grandpa died, when she still had the 5 youngest to raise, Grandma had moved to town and opened up a grocery store. Oh, how I wished I was a little more like Grandma. While I thought and worried, the preparations for our journey went on. A new bright white canvas covered was stretched over the bows of our wagon. Then the packing began. The wagon had high boards on its sides, making it nearly 4 feet deep. Father divided the space into 2 stories. On the bottom went everything that we would not be using every day, like the huge stacks of flowers, medicines that we would be using. On the bottom went everything that we would not be using every day, like the huge sacks of flour, medicine, extra clothing, and dishes and wagon parts. This was carefully leveled. Then a strong piece of canvas was stretched over it, making a kind of second floor. On top of this were placed all of the things that would be in daily use, neatly rolled and bundled. Father made a wooden grub box with a lid for food, and that sat in the front of the wagon with the cooking pots wrapped snugly in sacks. An outside box was attached to the wagon for halters, hobbles, ropes, chains, axes, shovel, hammer, and other tools. And there was a rack for Father's gun. One morning while I was watching Father repair a harness in the barn, another of our neighbors came to speak to him. It was John Ragsdale's mother, a small, faded-looking woman with a whispery voice. Please, she begged Father, you must take John with you. Father hesitated, looking at her. I could certainly use his help with the animals, he agreed. But are you sure? If he goes, there is no telling when you may see him again. I held my breath, hoping she would say yes. It wasn't surprising that John would want to go with us. We had taken him in a year ago because his stepfather was cruel to him. With 6 younger children to care for, including a new baby, his weary mother had nowhere else to turn. Father and Mother were fond of John, I knew, and there was something about his teasing ways that always cheered me. It would make a difference to all of us to have him along. His mother's flushed face seemed barely able to hold in her feelings, but she nodded firmly. He wants to go, she said. Then we will take him, Father promised. Now the time was growing near. The wagon had been pulled up close to the house for the final packing. Many of our neighbors gathered around to watch. Mother kept thinking of one more thing that just had to go. A few pieces of good blue and white china that had belonged to her mother, some pretty tablecloths, a quart of wild plum preserves. There were the books I could not do without. Father's Bible, a volume of Robert Burns' poetry, and one of the Longfellow, a Webster's Elementary Speller, and a 3rd reader, so Lavina and I could have lessons along the way. And the wooden wash tub, a big brass kettle, and the rolled up feather ticks that we would sleep on. As I handed them up one by one to Father, I thought that we were like birds building a nest. At last Father fastened a small water keg to the side of the wagon with a gourd dipper hanging beside it. He tied our two splint bottoms easy chairs to the back and hung the tar bucket for greasing the wheels underneath. We were ready to leave the following morning. I found it hard to fall asleep that night. While Lavina sighed like a sleeping kitten in the bed beside me, I lay stiff as a log, my eyes staring up into the darkness. All sorts of strange visions danced around in my brain. Painted Indian faces turned into Grandma's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Hens' eggs fell out of the sky, changed into snow, and piled up on our wagon. But despite all of my fears, I knew that nothing could keep us from making this journey now. Finally, with the words, "We're going to Oregon, we're going to Oregon," repeating over and over in my ears, I fell into an exhausted sleep. Then suddenly it was morning, a bright, sunny spring day, and Mother was calling us, "Mary Ellen! Lavina! Come and help!" We hurried through breakfast. I helped Mother pack up our lunch in the basket. Then Lavina and I went outside to hand up the last of the cooking pots and our quilts and feather pillows to Father. Mother was busy sweeping out the empty house to leave it tidy for the family whom we had sold it. Meanwhile, relatives and friends were arriving to say goodbye. "Go and ask Mother if she has anything else to go in the wagon," Father told me. I walked into the open door. Mother had finished sweeping, and the straw broom leaned against the wall next to the fireplace. That and a bare china cupboard that was too heavy to take with us were the only things left in the room that had always seemed crowded with furniture. I looked at the fireplace, neatly swept out now, and the places where our two easy chairs had sat. The outline the hearth rug still showed on the dark plank floor, worn smoothly by the tread of many feet. The room felt strange to me, empty and cold. Mother appeared, taking off her apron. "Father wants to know if there's anything else for the wagon," I said. "Just these." Mother held up a wooden spoon and a folded paper of her flower seeds. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stared around the room, trying to memorize it, not as it looked now, but as it used to be. Though Mother said nothing, I thought maybe she was doing the same. "Well," she said finally, "Father is waiting." Our footsteps made a hollow sound as we walked to the door. I didn't look back when Mother latched it. Father had sent John to gather up the animals. There were the 4 pair of oxen, 2 milk cows named Lily and Blackie, and our tame little heifer, Daisy. Lavina and I begged Father to take her along, and at last he had agreed. Then there was Father's 2 horses, Polly and Pet, and our watchdog, Rover. The oxen were soon hitched to the wagon, and Polly was saddled for John to ride. Father stood next to the team, his new whip ready in his hand. Still, he did not give the order to move out. We were being wrapped in hugs, covered with kisses, passed from one pair of arms to another. Cousin Fred nearly squeezed my breath away. Then came Cousin Martha and the minister's wife and Great Aunt Harriet. "You'll be a good girl, won't you, Mary Ellen?" she whispered in my ear. "And take care of your little sisters." "Oh, I just know we will never see you again," someone wailed. Cousin Will tickled me with his beard and passed me to Mrs. Pritchard, who enfolded me in her plump arms. "Keep up your courage," I heard the tall, pale young minister saying to Mother. "And whatever happens, don't fret. Courage will do more for you than anything else." John's mother and younger sisters hovered over him. Even George Kimball, as worried looking as ever, was giving Father some last-minute warning. Finally, I came to Grandma. "Oh, honey, honey," was all she could say to me, her bright blue eyes shining. "Remember," I told her fiercely, wrapping my arms around her waist, "you'll soon be coming to Oregon, too." Grandma did not answer, just held me close for a long time, and I felt tears falling on my hair. Slowly we climbed into the wagon underneath that clean white canvas cover. Mother was crying softly. Luvina and Cynthia looked scared. Finally, Father popped his whip. "Gee, Buck!" he shouted. The wheels began to turn, and the oxen moved toward the road. Looking back through the round gathered opening in the wagon cover, I saw all the familiar faces, some smiling, some tearful, the many waving hands. Grandma, leaning on Cousin Will's arm, looked small and forlorn, her handkerchief clutched in one hand, the breeze ruffling her wisps of white hair. Suddenly I was filled with the most overwhelming sadness. Maybe it was true, I thought. Maybe we would never see any of these faces again, not even Grandma. My eyes blurred with tears, and I couldn't help it. I put down my head and cried. When I finally was able to look back again, the faces had disappeared from sight. All I could see was the rutted dirt road, the pale green budding trees, and Rover, his white plum of a tail waving, running alongside the wagon. The wheels rattled and creaked. "Going to Oregon," they seemed to say. "Going to Oregon."